Please listen carefully.
Hello and welcome to GasGasGas, the podcast that covers the FRCA primary exam. We're going to fit into your day and give you as much of your life back as you could possibly imagine. I'm here to make your studying easier. Listen to us on your commute, in the gym, in the shower, or when you're ironing your scrubs. Expect facts, concepts, model answers and the odd tangent. Check out the show notes for all the detail and remember to follow the show so that you never miss an episode. Let's get on with it.
Hello everyone and welcome to another instalment of the VivaCast episodes with my dear colleague, co-conspirator, Tom. We are looking into the depths of hypoxia, how oxygen actually might get to a cell, and the hemoglobin disassociation curve. Time naturally continues to tick on for Tom, his exam creeping ever closer. So we will pile straight into it. Hope you enjoy the show.
Oh, yeah, that is time to move on. Could you classify hypoxia for me, please?
Hypoxia is the inadequate delivery of oxygen to the tissues. It can be thought of as anemic hypoxia, histotoxic hypoxia, hypoxic hypoxia, or ischemic hypoxia. So I mentioned anemic hypoxia first. So if we have reduced levels of hemoglobin in the blood, then we have less oxygen binding capacity and less oxygen carrying ability of the blood. And even with adequate oxygenation and gas exchange, you can still have inadequate delivery of oxygen to the tissues. In hypoxic hypoxia, that's the most straightforward type. If you have inadequate oxygen delivery to the blood within the pulmonary vascular bed, then that will lead to reduced oxygen delivery to the tissues. That can either be from reduced fraction of inspired oxygen or through impaired gas exchange within the lungs. Cytotoxic hypoxia can be caused by various substances such as cyanide or by sulfur dioxide gas. Both of these cause irreversible binding of oxygen to hemoglobin so that it can't be released into the tissues from capillary beds. So despite good oxygen gas exchange and adequate delivery of blood to the tissues, you still have reduced oxygen delivery at a cellular level. So talking about cytotoxic, hypoxic, histotoxic hypoxia. I think I may have mentioned ischemic hypoxia as well was the other one that I mentioned. So ischemic hypoxia relates to inadequate perfusion of tissue in order to deliver oxygen to it. So most commonly this could be caused by a thrombus or something such as a PE. All of these, really, the hypoxia itself means that mitochondria aren't getting adequate oxygen delivery at a cellular level and so cannot produce ADP at sufficient rates and cause stress at a cellular level.
So just for clarity, could you just tell me the mechanism of action of cyanide again, please?
So I mentioned that cyanide has an effect on oxygen binding to hemoglobin, but I was confusing with carbon monoxide, whereas I believe cyanide is toxic to mitochondria and stops the production of ADP at a mitochondrial level.
ATP.
Sorry, did I say ADP? I beg your pardon.
Did you say ATP?
Adenosine triphosphate.
Yeah, you did, yeah, mate. Yeah, adenosine triphosphate, yeah. Excellent. So you mentioned the phrase delivery of O2 quite a few times there. There's a formula that brings all that together. Could you tell me?
Yes. Oxygen delivery is equal to the cardiac output multiplied by the hemoglobin concentration multiplied by oxygen saturations. These can be modified with some numbers to give you mils per litre number at the end of it. So I think oxygen saturations are normally multiplied by 0.003 and hemoglobin levels are multiplied by 1.34 if the number's given in grams per litre.
Okay, so what does delivery of oxygen really tell you?
Oxygen delivery tells us how much oxygen is being made available to the tissues in order to use for respiration.
But then tell me how does oxygen transfer from plasma to the mitochondria? What governs that?
So once we reach a capillary level, oxygen has to be, first of all, released from hemoglobin, where it's primarily carried under the influence of 2-DPG and under the influence of local pH. So lower pH and high 3-DPG levels cause release of oxygen from hemoglobin, and presence of CO2 being released from the cells also causes some conformational changes in the hemoglobin that as CO2 binds to hemoglobin, it helps release oxygen as well. This then has to diffuse out of capillaries, which are specially designed essentially to be leaky at a very microscopic level and allow fluid to pass out into the interstitial space. Oxygen then diffuses across this space and across cell walls, being a small non-polar molecule, and diffuses into mitochondria within the cell. It's the mitochondria that then utilise oxygen in the oxygen transport chain in order to produce ADP.
The electron transport chain, Tom, is somewhere we're going to leave for next time. But what is the... Tell me about the relationship between saturation and plasma oxygen content.
You can draw a sigmoid graph representing the partial pressure of oxygen and oxygen saturations, known as the oxygen saturation curve. I believe the terminology escapes me currently, but this sigmoid shape will shift to the right or the left under the influence of various factors. So under normal conditions, the higher the partial pressure of oxygen within plasma, the higher the oxygen saturation. As we mentioned earlier, under the influence of lower pH or 2,3-DPG, oxygen is more easily given up. So for a lower partial pressure, you have for the same partial pressure of oxygen, you have a lower oxygen saturation, i.e. a shift of that curve to the left. Increased temperature will also cause a similar shift to the left. Some things can cause a shift to the right, so increasing plasma pH and reduced 2,3-DPG levels, for instance.
Okay, so just so we're super clear, the presence of 2,3-DPG at a higher amount, let's call it lots of 2,3-DPG, does that increase or decrease hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen?
It decreases hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen.
So a lack of it means that oxygen is held onto by the hemoglobin holds onto the oxygen when there's not as much. And then how does temperature influence it? So hot environments lead to
hyperthermia causes a shift of the hemoglobin dissociation curve to the right.
Yeah, the right.
So the affinity of hemoglobin decreases.
Yeah, because it's just there's more energy in the system, so the oxygen's more like, let me go. At least that's how I imagine it.
So just to clarify there, James, sorry. So I think I was right the first time around with that. I think decreased affinity is a left shift.
So everyone, that was Tom, pounding his way through these topics. But just so that we are all singing from the same hymn sheet, I'm going to go over the show notes very quickly here. So I asked Tom about the classification of hypoxia. And I think about this classification as the different ways that oxygen fails to get from the atmosphere to the electron transport chain. You could even go as far as to imagine someone stood atop Everest. They're experiencing hypoxia because there's a low fraction of oxygen available in the alveolus. This can also come about if someone is hypoventilating and the fraction of oxygen deteriorates in the alveolus over time as it is taken up by blood flow crossing the alveolus. Or perhaps they have anemic hypoxia because there's either insufficient hemoglobin going around the place, i.e. they've fallen off Everest and they're quietly bleeding to death, or perhaps they were cooking inside their tent and they have now got carbon monoxide poisoning and their hemoglobin is dysfunctional. Perhaps they've been atop Everest and they've had a spot of myocardial infarction, and now they have cardiogenic shock. They're just not pumping enough oxygen around their body to their tissues. They have stagnant hypoxia. Or perhaps, for some inexplicable reason, someone has poisoned them on top of Everest with cyanide, and now they have histo, or cytotoxic hypoxia. So the classification of hypoxia, guys, is either hypoxic hypoxia, not enough oxygen in alveolus, anemic hypoxia, either a lack of hemoglobin in the plasma or dysfunctioned hemoglobin. Stagnant hypoxia, i.e. shock, a failure of the hemoglobin you have to get where it needs to go, or cytotoxic hypoxia, the mitochondria is defunctioned, cyanide poisoning. We then go on to delivery of oxygen. This brings together two concepts. One, your cardiac output, i.e. how much blood is going round and round, and is multiplied by the amount of oxygen currently carried in your blood, which is worked out by knowing the saturations of that blood, your hemoglobin concentration of that blood, as well as the partial pressure of oxygen in blood, because there is a dissolved quantity of oxygen in blood, as we all know. And this is all multiplied together in a manner which is in the show notes. And the critical bit of information we need to know is how much oxygen is carried per unit of hemoglobin, or gram of hemoglobin. And that is, in reality, 1.34 mils of oxygen per 1 gram of hemoglobin. Important number to remember. We then touched on the oxyhemoglobin disassociation curve, and Tom described a sigmoidal structure that shifts to the right or the left depending on the environment the hemoglobin finds itself in. A shift to the left yields a greater affinity for oxygen, whereas a shift to the right yields a lesser affinity for oxygen, i.e. left shifts, the hemoglobin holds onto oxygen. Right shifts in this curve, it releases oxygen. There are a bunch of factors on either side of this situation that can cause these events. A left shift, classically, a raised pH, i.e. a slightly more alkali environment, a cooler temperature, less 2,3 DPG levels. And for example, if you're using fetal hemoglobin, which we know has a higher affinity for oxygen, and that's how fetuses get their oxygen across that placenta. Drivers to the right, i.e. things that reduce oxygen affinity. Acidic environments. Environments with an increased temperature. Environments with a greater level of 2,3 DPG. Have a read of the show notes, get on the internet and look at these curves. Try and fix them in your mind, and try and think of something that works for you that helps you remember which way left and right is for this. Because I've not thought of a good one. Maybe you can email me, and I can put it on the show notes as well.
Thanks for listening to that episode, guys. If you found it useful or awful, please like and subscribe and rate the show. Definitely go check out those show notes on GasGasGas.uk. We all know that this is a bucket of content. I want you to take some time for yourself and don't overcook it. Don't freak out. Keep studying.